Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jim Musser. I'm the Director of Economic Education at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and welcome to the launch of the third edition of our Freedom in the 50 States Index. It has lots of new and promising features, and I think that our authors are going to be very excited to talk to you about the changes and what they have found. The opportunities at the state level right now are just tremendous, and good policy makes for good politics, and I think we've got some good policy recommendations that we can offer from the new index, and we'll allow our speakers to address that at more length. Please continue to go ahead and enjoy your lunch, but we're going to try and be respectful of everybody's time and keep the trains running right on time. There will be time for Q&A after all of our speakers have concluded. And so with that bit of background, I'll go ahead and just introduce the speakers right down the row here. We'll start with Dr. Will Ruger. Dr. Ruger is an affiliated scholar at the Mercatus Center and an assistant professor at Texas State University, San Marcos. He, in addition to being a co-author on the Index of Freedom in the 50 States, has written for a number of scholarly journals, and his primary interests in study are international politics, but he's lent considerable talent to this endeavor, focused on how we can improve our states and how we can benefit from freedom. And I'm looking forward to hearing from him. Next to him, the other author of our index, Dr. Jason Sorens, is also an affiliated scholar with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University, and he is an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo SUNY. He has a long history in the freedom movement and is an adopted son, much like Will, of Virginia. Both of them have degrees from institutions here in Virginia. Will from William and Mary, an undergraduate degree, and Jason from Washington and Lee. They left us, they deserted us for their PhDs, but they're adopted native sons, and we're so thrilled to have both of them with us. Because the panel should be taking ideas into action, we don't just have our scholars, but we also have policy practitioners with us. Jonathan Williams is our next panelist. Jonathan is with the American Legislative Exchange Council, and he heads the Center for State and Fiscal Reform, as well as the Tax and Fiscal Policy Task Force at ALEC. And probably equally important for this panel, he is a co-author, along with Art Laffer, on the Rich State, Poor State study, which has been received very well across the country, has been quite successful, and I think he can probably talk to you a little bit about the complementary nature of our different studies. Jonathan, I would be remiss if I didn't mention, was also the winner of the very prestigious Ludwig von Mises Award in Economics. He's you probably have seen Jonathan somewhere along the way on TV, or maybe you've heard him on C-SPAN radio. He pops up in all sorts of places and has written articles that you find in the popular press. We are thrilled to have our friend Jonathan with us. And our final panelist is Delegate Jim Lemunion from here in Virginia. Virginia has done pretty well in our index over the last few years, and we're very pleased with that, but there's plenty of room for improvement. Delegate Lemunion can address that from a practitioner's standpoint, being a current member of the House of Delegates. He went to the House of Delegates in 2009 and has since become a deputy whip. He's on 3 committees: General Laws, Education, and the Counties, Cities, and Towns Committee. Probably for our purposes, it's important for you to know he has been a real proponent of legislation to make government more accountable and much more transparent, and has been quite successful in that. And I know he believes that there's plenty of work still to do, and I suspect he'll mention that along the way today. but he is the kind of citizen legislator that we would all like to have. He's an entrepreneur, a businessman. He's actually created things and met payrolls and understands exactly what it means to be trying to create and produce while you're facing lots of regulation, when you're facing taxes, and still trying to make your customers happy. So, with all of that being said and a blockbuster panel in front of us, I'm going to turn it over to Will Ruger so that you can hear what you're actually interested in hearing.
We have slides. Oh, okay. Can you click this? Do I click it myself? Okay, there you go. Thanks. Okay, so I want to welcome everyone here. Thank you very much. Appreciate you coming in, and I also want to thank from Jason and myself. I want to thank Mercatus for supporting this research and doing a great job, especially on the creative side. Love the videos and the other things. The cover of the book is great, so I wanted to thank you. Let's talk about what is this Freedom Index that we've heard so much about. Well, it's the most comprehensive study and ranking of freedom across the 50 states that's available. And this is the third edition of the study. We've had another edition come out in 2009, 2011, and now here in 2013. And we think this is a new and improved, a bigger, badder study this year. And Jason will talk a little bit about some of the differences between the other studies. But I think it's gotten better every year, and I'm really excited about this edition. What we do in this Freedom Index in terms of the rankings and the study is we look at three different areas: fiscal policy, regulatory policy, and policies that affect personal freedom. So we're looking at state and local policies that affect freedom. Now you might ask, given the fact that the federal government does so much and the fact that federalism has been in decline over the last century, aren't most things going on in politics happening in Washington and at the federal level? And we would argue that there's no doubt there's a lot going on at the federal level, and we're seeing some impingement on the states, particularly with things like the Affordable Care Act or Obamacare. But still, the American federal system allows a lot of discretion by states on important policy issues that affect us in our daily lives. So federalism is still alive despite that decline. And we only just have to look at Washington and Colorado to see that, where you've not only seen states changing policies on important areas for many of their citizens, but we've also seen them challenging the federal government. It's not just that they're given the discretion to do this, they're actually challenging the feds. So the state, what's going on in the state houses, like down in Richmond, is very important to people's lives, and that's why we think it's important to look at these state policies. Not to mention the fact that this issue of freedom and of federalism is important for state governments because they have to compete with each other because of our system. They have to compete for tax base, and they have to compete for citizens who can vote with their feet. And so it's really important, I think, that we not just focus on Washington, but we also focus on what's happening out in the 50 states and in the capitals of those states. So what's the purpose of the Freedom Index? It's to measure and compare the states on how their public policies affect freedom. And I'll talk about that, how we define freedom in a minute. But we also want to investigate the relationship between freedom and other things that are also important to us, such as economic growth and migration patterns. So it's not just that we're looking at freedom itself, we're looking at the effects and consequences of freedom. Now we think this can be useful for legislators and their staffs. They can look at their state, look at the data, and compare their states to others to see how they're doing. Sometimes you can get in a little bit of a kind of stovepipe in your state, what we're doing here. This allows people to look at what's going on in the rest of the country. Scholars can use this to try to model politics. Businesses can use this to think about where they might want to invest, where they might want to relocate if they're thinking about decisions in that area, particularly when it comes to regulatory policy. Reporters, journalists can use this to keep their own state leaders honest. They can look at the data in the same way the staffers can, and they can say, well, what's going on in these other states? Why aren't you doing this? Or you're claiming that this is so important, but 48 other states don't do it that way. What's novel or what's great about what we're doing? So it's a good way for reporters, I think, to use that data and keep their politicians honest. And then individual citizens who might want to vote with their feet, either because they're retiring or or otherwise, but they want to be able to move to a place that maybe has a certain bundle of goods or policies that they like, so they can kind of sort themselves that way. So I think there's a lot of different purposes that this study can be used for, not just the kind of sexy rankings of the states. Now, how do we define freedom? Well, we define it in a fairly typical way in the American or Western tradition. Freedom for us is a situation in which individuals are allowed to dispose of their lives, liberty, and property as they see fit, consistent with the rights of others to enjoy those same abilities. So it's basic rights, right? The protection of basic rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so to speak. Now, this includes freedom from, freedom as we see it includes freedom from both public and private interference, but we're only measuring the public interference. Measuring government effectiveness at protecting rights is an important thing to do, very difficult, but it's not what we're focusing on here. So the fact is one isn't free if one is being, if one's private property or person is being violated by other citizens. But what we're focusing on here are government policies that affect individual freedom. Now, it's important to note that we exclude two policies that are pretty controversial. One is abortion, the other is the death penalty. And we do that for a good reason. It's not that we're ducking the issue. The reason why we do this is because according to our definition of freedom, there's two different narratives on both of these policies that one could tell. So it could cut both ways. So for example, on abortion, one could believe that the fetus is indeed an individual who has these rights and that the state ought to protect it, and therefore restrictions on abortion are actually rights enhancing. On an alternative narrative, you could say that the fetus is something that is part of a woman's body, and it's up to the woman to choose to deal with her sexual or reproductive freedom as she sees fit, and therefore restrictions on abortion would be violation of her freedom. So it can cut both ways, and so rather than taking a position either way on that issue, we've left it out of the Freedom Index, although we do code it and provide the data in terms of what's on the website so that people can look at it across the board and compare states on even that issue. Same thing on the death penalty. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Sorens here so that he can talk about the methods and some of the other aspects of the study before he'll turn it back, and I'll talk about some of those consequences of freedom.
Okay, so I wanted to talk first about some of the significant improvements we've tried to make in this third edition of the study. First, we've taken the data up to 2011. So all the policies we have are coded as of the end of each of these years. End of 2010, date of enactment. So these are policies that had to be passed by the legislature, signed by the governor by the end of 2010. And so they reflect basically the state of freedom in early 2011. And similarly, we've got 2009, 2007, and we've coded back to 2001. So now we have a full decade of data in which we can compare how states have evolved over time. The second important improvement is a new methodology for aggregating policies to create an overall index. Every index has to have some way of doing this, of aggregating policies. How do you measure freedom? How do you compare taxes and government spending and regulations on business and regulations on personal freedoms? You have to have some way of adding them all up. In the past, we've used a sort of subjective method. We've sort of eyeballed it and said, well, here are some policies that are clearly at the highest level of importance. Here are some that are much less important and less important, and so on. And that's not an awful way of doing it, but it's also subjective. So for the first time, we have tried to use an objective weighting matrix. We're using weights to aggregate these variables that are based on the value of each freedom to the people who enjoy it. So if we're looking at, for instance, something trivial, it's less than 1% of the index, less than 0.1% of the index, whether a state bans happy hours. Bars are banned from having happy hours in some states. Okay, small policy, but it's in there. How do we weight that? Well, we look at the effect of that ban on the revenues that that bars get. They're going to lose revenue if they're banned from having happy hours. Often they have to just close up shop at at low traffic times of the day. So that gives us an indicator of the value of that freedom to bars, to being able to open up. And so we do this for each of these variables. We look at economics papers, public policy papers, the research that's out there to figure out for each variable the dollar value of that freedom to the people enjoying it. And that's the way we aggregate all these variables. But this isn't a cost-benefit analysis because we're not including the advantages of unfreedom. And we acknowledge that in some cases there can be costs and benefits on both sides of an issue. Maybe there are some people who want to ban happy hours, and they're happier when there's a happy hour ban. Okay, we don't include that in the index, right? Because we're trying to measure freedom. We're not trying to measure social welfare or utility or something like that. We've also included a number of new variables, especially in regulatory policy. We made a concerted effort to improve our measures of regulatory policy and added new variables for insurance regulations and regulations on building new hospitals and all sorts of other things. And we have now over 200 individual public policies that are now feeding into this index. Here's how the weights add up for the different categories. We have three dimensions: fiscal policy, regulatory policy, and personal freedom. Fiscal policy having to do with taxing and spending, regulatory policy or regulations on business. Personal freedoms are basically lifestyle freedoms, paternalist restrictions on individual decision making. And each of these ends up being worth about a third of the index. Within fiscal policy itself, you'll see on the right-hand side, tax burden is the biggest part, but we also have government employment, government spending, government debt, and fiscal decentralization. Within regulatory policy, we have the following categories, and each of these categories is made up of multiple variables. Starting from least important in regulatory policy on the left-hand side, we've got cable and telecom deregulation, miscellaneous regulations, just anything that didn't fit into another category. Occupational freedom, whether you're required to get a license, what the licensing requirements are, how onerous they are. Labor market policies like minimum wage, right to work, workers' comp, mandates, and so on. Health insurance, which includes community rating, guaranteed issue, defined essential benefits, and a myriad other regulations on health insurance policies. Real property rights, which has to do with, especially with land use. So we include in here local zoning laws, rent control, eminent domain reform, to what extent states place a limit on government use of eminent domain to transfer property to private parties. And then finally, the liability system, the quality of the court system, whether it has a lot of tort abuse and it's easy to get lawsuit jackpots through the court system. Then finally, on the right-hand side, we've got personal freedom, campaign finance, asset forfeiture, travel. That includes restrictions on motorists and bicyclists as well. Mala prohibita and civil liberties, which is sort of miscellaneous personal freedoms that didn't fit into another category. Education freedom, school choice, homeschooling regulations, private school regulations, gambling laws, marijuana laws, marriage laws, alcohol laws, tobacco laws, and smoking bans fit in there too. Gun control. And finally, victimless crimes, which is a category that includes incarceration rates adjusted for each state's crime rate. So does the state imprison more people than you would expect given their crime rate? If so, that indicates they're probably locking up lots of nonviolent offenders and having long sentences. We also include arrest rates for various victimless crimes, liquor laws, drug laws, gun laws, etc. And at the end of the day, here's how the freedom ranking came out. North Dakota ends up number 1 for the first time. South Dakota number 2, close behind. Tennessee again close behind at number 3. New Hampshire 4th, and Oklahoma a little way behind at number 5. And then finally at the very bottom, once again, no matter how you weight the variables, I guess, New York is a bad place for freedom. Far in last place. And then California, and then New Jersey, and then Hawaii, and then Rhode Island. Probably none of these are terribly surprising. Different indices might rank these slightly differently, but I don't think anyone is shocked by any of the states here. Here's the scatter plot of personal and economic freedom. You can see that some states do well on one or the other, or neither, or both. The only state that really does well on both personal and economic freedom is New Hampshire. For the Dakotas, the reason they do so well, and Tennessee, is that they're just real outliers on economic freedom, as you can see on the right-hand side there. And that makes up for their deficiencies on personal freedom. But if you're more interested in lifestyle freedoms, personal freedoms, then you'll be interested in states like Alaska, Nevada, Maine, New Mexico, and New Hampshire. Again, probably not surprising that those are the states that are highest in personal freedom. And at the very bottom in personal freedom, we have Illinois, Maryland. New York also does badly on both dimensions. California might surprise you. They do badly on personal freedom as well as economic freedom. So one of the things we found with this index is that states that are liberal are not necessarily better on personal freedoms the way the common assumption runs. The conservative states are bad for personal freedoms, good for economic freedoms, and liberal states are the opposite. We didn't really find that in this index. We found that liberal states, the very liberal states, like New York and California and Hawaii and places like that, were just bad all around for freedom. Here we have change in freedom over this decade, 2001 to 2011. Oklahoma and North Dakota are right at the top. And maybe it's not surprising then that these are two of the fastest growing states in the last couple of years. These are states that have improved their economic environment dramatically. Idaho's up there as well, Utah and New Mexico. At the bottom we have Wyoming, which has had a substantial increase in its measured tax burden for various reasons. Illinois has also declined. New Jersey, New York, and Kansas have all declined. We didn't find any general relationship between how a state stood in 2001 and its change over the next decade. It wasn't that states that were already good did better than states that were already bad. As you can see here, it's sort of a mixed bag. Wyoming used to be high on freedom, and now it's relatively low. Kansas used to be fairly high, and now it's sort of middle. The average state declined by 13 points on personal freedom, but increased by 4 points on economic freedom. So we've actually seen some decline nationwide on personal freedom. And as I've mentioned before, as public opinion becomes more liberal as measured by left-of-center presidential vote choice, overall freedom declines. We think that's probably causal, but that's the correlation. However, moderate conservative states are no less free than strongly conservative states. Okay, now I'm going to turn it over finally to William to summarize the results on freedom and migration and growth.
Yeah, thank you. So what are the effects of the freedom that Jason talked about? Well, one of the things that we found out when it came to migration is, yes, that people are voting with their feet. When it comes to both fiscal, regulatory, or all these things, fiscal, regulatory, and personal freedom, that these are all statistically significant when it comes, or they're correlated with net migration rates between 2000 and 2010. In other words, people are leaving less free states and moving to more free states in this period. And what's interesting is that these results hold even when we control for things like climate. So it's not just that people are moving to Sun Belt states like Arizona or to Texas or to Florida. It's not just that they're moving to states like Colorado or Maine that have, nice amenities like mountains or oceans, but they're moving to places that are more free, even when we take out the economic side. So personal freedom is also correlated with migration. And here's the regressions if you're interested. Most people aren't, but it just shows you that there's some science behind this. And then the next question is, was Adam Smith right? This is a famous quotation from Adam Smith, one of my favorites. He talks about how we go from barbarism to opulence through peace, easy taxes, and a fair administration of justice. In other words, he thinks that freedom is correlated with economic growth. Well, what do we find? We find that this is indeed the case. Now, it's not surprising for people like me and Jason that like Adam Smith and think that a free society stimulates economic activity. But at least here we have some data to prove it, right? What we see is that fiscal and regulatory policies are positively associated with real personal income growth. Okay? And in particular, regulatory policy matters a lot here. And so if you're from Indiana or if you're looking to move to Indiana, that's a place where you've seen regulatory policies becoming very free market. They're number one in the index. Other places like Delaware also do quite well. These are places that we would expect to see a lot of economic growth because of the fact that they have a regulatory environment conducive to that. And here's the regressions. So in conclusion, what we see here is that federalism still matters. States vary widely when it comes to freedom, and that we have outcomes or consequences that are affected by that. Now, while personal freedom is in decline slightly nationwide, economic freedom has held its own. And it also shows you, I think, our study that people, freedom is important intrinsically. Okay? Even if it didn't have these great outcomes, I think we ought to respect people's lives, liberty, and property. But freedom matters for things like economic growth and migration. And I would want to point out one thing. I mean, if you're a legislator in a state like California or New York or Illinois, what you're seeing is that people are leaving your state, and that has all kinds of ramifications for other aspects of your political life. So even if you don't care too much about freedom, but you care about making sure that the golden goose still lays eggs, you need to make sure you're careful about this. California lost 4.5% of its population between 2000 and 2011. New York lost 9% of its 2000 population. Illinois lost about 4.5%. Okay? These people are leaving those states in droves, and they're going to places like Arizona, going to places like Idaho, places that are booming and places that are much more free, places like New Hampshire. And if you just look at some of the comparisons. So while Illinois lost a fair amount of its population, Indiana was roughly stable in terms of its migration patterns. Let's face it, Illinois has Chicago, Indiana doesn't. And yet Indiana is doing better in terms of attracting people and not repelling people. Or New Hampshire. People aren't moving to New Hampshire for the weather, right? I mean, I like it. I personally think it would be a great idea to move there for that reason. But most people don't, right? They want sun and they want less cold and snow. But New Hampshire gained about 3% of population over the decade, whereas other states in that area, Vermont, Massachusetts, lost population. So I think what that says is really important to legislators and us, which is that our children are going to leave their homes and go to other states potentially if we don't get our act together and maintain a free society. It means that we might have to leave the place that we would choose to live. Or it means that one of the great things about a federal system is that we can leave for those things that we care about. And as long as we have the right to exit and enter, it's a wonderful thing because we can kind of sort ourselves based on the policies we like. And then lastly, I'd like to mention that we provide all of this data on the Mercatus Center website. In fact, there's a tool there in which you can try to use your own definition of freedom. So if you don't agree with ours, that's perfectly fine. We understand. I mean, we like the one we have. I think it's very consistent with the kind of Western liberal tradition. But if you have a different definition and want to go to the website, you can kind of plug things in there based on your own understanding and weighting of the policies. And because I think ultimately what it means to be liberal is to have some humility about what you think is true, or at least about how we should realize those truths. And so you can go there and do that. But in terms of our index, I think we have a good measure. I think we have a good definition, and I think we've seen some interesting results. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. Once again, Jonathan Williams with the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, and it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. Thank you to our good friends at the Mercatus Center for inviting me to be part of this. I guess it was 2 years ago at the release of the last edition of this report. I was also here with the authors, and things have changed quite a bit across the states over the last 2 years, but it's good to be back. We really rely heavily on the Mercatus Center and your scholars for producing high-quality research, and I know our 2,000 legislative members, both Republicans and Democrats, really appreciate this work as well. And so I wanted to just take a few moments today to talk about how freedom in the 50 states really correlates very nicely with our Rich States, Poor States report. That's an annual publication. We're going to be coming out with the 6th edition of it probably in May this year. But just from a overall glance, this is really highly correlated with the top 10, bottom 10 states in our index rankings. Now, our index is put together a little bit in a smaller level. It's only 15 equally weighted variables. They also consider tax policy, regulatory policy, and labor policy mostly. And so our top 10 states, for instance, 7 of our top 10 are also in the top 10 freedom in the 50 states this year. So 70% we share in the top 10. Also, if you go to the bottom 10 of our index, New York, by the way, is 50th out of 50 in ours as well. So it's not only Alec that Governor Cuomo is going to hate, it's going to be you guys as well. So I was just saying, I don't know why they still have the Statue of Liberty there in New York with rating 50th in all these free market indices. But when it comes to that tells you something. We measure things that are a little bit narrowly focused on fiscal and economic regulatory policy. This broadens out, of course, in the Freedom in the 50 States Index to personal freedom. But it does tell you something that these states have that method of governance, that reliance on statism, whether it's personal or economic, that they would fall that heavily correlated both in the top 10 and bottom 10 states in both of our indices over that period of time. I think that's a very interesting result from this. Now, my story and why I think this is important is, I come from Michigan, and unfortunately on the cover of your book this year, we were known for high minimum wage, I guess, is our state. Now, I will say one thing in defense of my home state, and it was pretty indefensible for a couple of decades there, but today we become a freedom to work state. Michigan is the last state, the 24th state in the country to pass a right to work law to give workers the option of working with not having to join a union in Michigan. And some people thought that was a pipe dream in Michigan over the years, and I probably was part of that group. But today is the start of a new day in Michigan. Of course, we've made some other changes on the tax side of things, and so hopefully when you do this next time, we'll say freedom to work is the big highlight for Michigan, and we'll see some results over the next couple of years as well. But that's a very interesting point as well, is that these results are not fixed. We see great movement among states year over year. We started doing rich states, poor states in 2007. Back then, for instance, 42 states had budget surpluses as we wrote the first edition of the book. Now, of course, we went through this period of wailing and gnashing of teeth across state budgets because things got pretty tough. Now, our friends here at Mercatus Center calculated that state and local spending grew 90% faster than the private sector in the period leading up to the downturn. So I think we have a good idea what caused the difficult times in the states. But now, of course, we're seeing some life again. Some states that have gotten it right when it comes to policy are reaping the rewards of their good policies, I believe. It's really hard to ignore the Texas model. They gained 4 congressional seats in the last 10 years. Congressional seats, something like 700,000 Americans. So on net, they gained a ton of folks over the last 10 years. Florida gained 2 congressional seats, another by the way, no income tax state, both Florida and Texas. And then California, as we talked about, the weather's great. They have amazing amenities. San Francisco's a fun town. San Diego's amazing. But for some reason, Americans continue to vote with their feet away from California. In fact, 1.5 million Americans on net have voted with their feet and moved to one of the other 49 states over the last 10 years alone. That's incredible. And for the first time in state history, California will not gain a congressional seat, or did not in the 2010 round of apportionment. It's probably good for those of you that believe in limited government that you don't have another Nancy Pelosi roaming the halls of Congress. But that being said, one of the key findings of our book as well is, we have this, being at a law school, Justice Brandeis came up with this notion of laboratories of democracy that our founders wisely put together, that people continue to be able to, thanks to the freedom of association, vote with their feet. They continue to show very strong results in voting towards the states that value freedom. Ours is focused mostly on tax and economic, but for instance, one of the things is states that do without an income tax. There's 9 states in the country now that do not impose an income tax on wage income. New Hampshire being one of those up in the Northeast, the live free or die state, or some say the light in the sea of darkness of bad economic policy in the Northeast. But these states continually outshine their high tax counterparts, and we think that not only tax burden matters, but also the way that you go about taxing. And this is something that's not unique to us, but academic evidence, OECD, and other organizations also back that up. But what is really clear is that our founders gave states the choice. They can choose to follow the high tax, progressive model, if you will, of California, New York, New Jersey, Illinois, or they can choose the low tax, freedom-loving model of Texas, Arizona, Florida, and the like. And it's, I think, very clear over the last 10 years what businesses and individuals are choosing. Now, what do states do to make up the difference if they're a high tax model? Because that's a choice. If you want to be that way as a state, you're more than free to go ahead and make the wrong decisions, right? And they're paying the consequences of that. But what they do to make up for it oftentimes is it complicates the matter even further. So you look at Illinois, which a couple of years ago raised taxes by 65% on income. Now, what did they do to make up for it? Because they were feeling competitive pressure. That's something that you cannot ignore as a state. You can't ignore the laws of economics for long. They'll come back to bite you. So Illinois was really on the verge of losing a couple of its major corporations. Sears and Roebuck Company, CME Group, the Mercantile Exchange. We're saying we're going to maybe pick up and go to Texas or someplace that's going to treat us more favorably. So what did the state of Illinois do? They basically offered direct tax incentives to those companies to keep them there. And so I think that you have this, it's emblematic of a larger problem. When you allow your business climate to become poor, then you all of a sudden get into this situation of having to, or in their case, they're not having to, but they choose to make these special incentives to particular industries or particular companies to keep them there. And I know there's been a lot of work done by Matt Mitchell here and others about the problems with government cronyism when you start giving special tax favors to special industries or special companies. And that's really one of the consequences of bad policymaking overall. If taxes get too high, you get into this position, you're going to lose your companies if you don't make some sort of a provision. Now, I think in the long run, we all believe that treating everyone equally by low tax rates and limited government regulation is a way to have the most healthy economy, but that's certainly one other model that states are looking to follow. And so I would say that freedom works across the 50 states. That's a good thing, and we can rely as people who believe in liberty on the data out there over the last 10 years. It's very strong, but not only just over the last 10 years. You go back as far as we have reliable data. The states that keep taxes low, the states that have, for instance, lower taxes on capital, always outperform their high tax counterparts. Just over the last 15 years, based on IRS data, something like $2 trillion moved between the states. It's an incredible prize that's out there waiting for states that get things right. Over the last 10 years, another way of looking at it, something like 4.2 million Americans on net have left this 10 states with the highest tax burden. That's nearly 1 a minute. That continues to trickle out of states like California and New York. So there's the consequences. And in our beauty of the American experiment, states get to decide which way they're going to go in terms of policy. So I once again commend the authors of Freedom in 50 States. We look forward to continuing our work together to show that freedom does in fact work across our laboratories of democracy. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Jim LeMunyon, as previously introduced. I don't have slides, so I'm just gonna maybe take off on a couple of things that you've heard already. First, to tell you that from a state legislator standpoint, these rankings actually matter. We pay attention to, many of us pay attention to them. Not everyone does. You saw some states that were kind of the outliers on some of these scales. They're clearly not paying attention, or the defined terms for economic progress or freedom are just not things that matter a whole lot to them. And it's not just rankings. It's even things that go on day to day that maybe sometimes make the news, sometimes don't. And I'll just give you some examples. We have here in Virginia, as you may know, the legislature is only in session 6 to 8 weeks a year. We wrapped up in late February. The governor's got a month to recommend amendments. We approve them if we're not, but he recommends them or can veto bills. And he's actually vetoed a bill related to the hotel tax here in Arlington County, because it would raise it too much relative to D.C., and he doesn't want the hotel business to go to Washington, just right across the river. So this is the kind of thing that goes on day to day, doesn't make the front page of the newspaper necessarily, but to the governor's credit, he pays attention to this. Now, when you talk about people moving from one state to another over the course of time for various reasons, this is not just something where legislators, governors are passive. Okay, sometimes we actually work aggressively to entice people to do this if we think we've got a better story, and I think most of us think we do in Virginia. By way of example, I introduced an amendment to the state budget, $500,000, wasn't new money, reprogrammed from the economic development budget, to open an office in Northern California specifically for the purpose of recruiting companies away from California to move to Virginia. The governor, our governor, Bob McDonnell, Rick Perry from Texas, will be in Orange County, California in the next month to recruit companies from California to Virginia. And in fact, it works. In the last 3 years, Northrop Grumman has set up its headquarters just down the road there in Falls Church. Hilton is over in McLean, right next to the McLean Hilton. And so these issues matter in the real world in terms of dollars and cents, in terms of success in terms of shareholders, return on their investment in these companies. And so that's why it's a big deal, and it's not just something where well, let's get the rules right and everybody else will figure out where to go. We actually work it. Not every state does, but many of us do. In terms of the rankings themselves, and we've talked about 2 today, there are others that come along. There's business-friendly states. Virginia was number 1, then we fell to 3. Governor Perry from Texas called Governor McDonnell to kind of gloat about that, so these things do become actually personal. But one of the things that the hard part from a legislator's standpoint, and we do pay attention to these different ratings, the ratings tend to be a diagnosis of what's going well and maybe what's not in some places. The prescription about what you do about it is a different matter, and is much more, or needs to be much more tailored to a specific circumstances in specific states. And that's, I guess, what the job of a legislator is, and it's not easy. I'll just tell you all right now, we could use more help. I'll give you some examples in case you're all looking for more work to do. We're only in session, as I mentioned, 6 to 8 weeks a year. Most of us have day jobs. So as much as we'd like to spend 365 days a year working with state public policy, kind of like the folks in Congress have time to do, well, I'm not going to get into Congress, but we actually don't have the bandwidth, so to speak, to do it all. So typically what happens in our off-season, which is now sort of starting next week, we go back one day, I guess Wednesday next week, to handle 80-some amendments and vetoes that the governor has. Then we're gone till next January. There's an election in November, and then we come back in January. That's the time when issues sort of get sorted out, priorities get sorted out. We've got a governor's race this year. That'll help set some agenda for next year. But that's when the thinking gets done. In Virginia, just in case you don't know, we have a system whereby if I introduce a bill in the House, if that bill hasn't passed in 3 or 4 weeks, it's dead for the year, because we have a crossover system so that halfway through the legislative process, the bill's got to go to the Senate for the Senate to act to get everything done in a month and a half or 2 months. So we don't, just to be candid, we don't do a lot of sort of in-depth thinking while we're in session. It's all movement. If the thinking wasn't done and the issues lined up ahead of time, it's just not going to happen. Wait till next year. I mean, people on Capitol Hill, they've got, what's it now, the end of March, they're planning for hearings in May. Who might show up? What topics would we consider? What questions to ask? I mean, when you're in Richmond and it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, you're thinking about the hearing at 9 tomorrow morning, okay? Because there may not be one next week, and there won't be one next month. The legislative process is that quick. So the kind of work that you all do to help us with that windup is frankly more important, and I would argue you can have a lot more impact at the state level than you can at the federal level, if for no other reason. Let me tell you about a few things we've done, in some cases related to rankings and how Virginia's turned up, and some things that still need doing. And one of the things when we look at the what's the prescription, different from the diagnosis, is we like to look at, and to use a business phrase, best practices from other states. some states got, 1, 2, or 3 on the rank, and we're down there at 20. What are they doing right? And what can we learn from them as opposed to, well, we're Virginia and we're just going to think up the answer and not really pay attention to what 49 other states may have already tried that worked or tried that didn't work. A couple things that we've done that I think are working. We'll see some of this takes a period of years or even decades to come to fruition. And I'm going to just sort of hop around the policy spectrum. Teacher tenure reform. Every teacher in Virginia is going to have to get an evaluation once every 3 years, a formal evaluation, an informal evaluation every year. And if you're considered unsatisfactory, you can be removed from the teaching profession in about 4 or 5 weeks. Okay, a lot like the private sector. So this idea of lifetime employment because you have tenure is gone starting July 1st of this year. Pension reform. We've moved from you're a state employee, including a local government employee in Virginia, including a teacher. You work for 25, 30 years, you're guaranteed a pension of a certain amount as long as you live. For new entrants into the state workforce, it's going to look a lot more like a 401k plan. So it's a defined contribution versus defined benefit, as they call it, in that arena. And what that means from the standpoint of the state budget is a lot less of an unfunded liability going forward, because we just looked at what that meant. The good news is people are living longer, so they're on these pensions a lot longer than they used to be. Unless you're willing to have a substantial tax hike to pay for that, you just can't sustain something like that. And that's not unique to Virginia. That's going on in a number of other states as well. Cost-benefit analysis for transportation is something we started last year, specific to Northern Virginia where we have the biggest problem. But transportation projects in Northern Virginia are being rated based on what they'll do to reduce congestion for the tax dollars spent. And so that's you would think, I go door to door, talk to voters, people think, why weren't we doing this 30 years ago? Good question. I tell you why. It's because politicians like to spend money on their pet projects rather than maybe use something objective. Some things that we're still working on: Medicaid reform. Won't go into that in detail, but that's a big problem. Medicaid in Virginia is growing twice as fast as everything else in the budget, and that's without the expansion related to federal health care. It's been killing our state budget in terms of the general fund. We go from about 11% for Medicaid 10 years ago to 22% today. You just cannot sustain that in Virginia and other states. I was down in Florida last month, or actually last week. Their legislature's in session. They're looking at putting the new people from the federal expansion program into private health insurance. And they're going to need to get permission from Washington to do that, as opposed to just putting them in the traditional Medicaid program. Whether that works or not, I don't know. But that's the kind of idea mix and, frankly, advice that state legislators need in looking at how to address these problems. Synchronizing transportation with land use, something we don't do very well in Northern Virginia, haven't. I don't know what the answer is to that, but if somebody's got the answer from another state, I'd love to know it. And finally, our tax code, which I hope becomes an issue of debate in our governor's race this year. We have an archaic tax code in Virginia. It's not indexed to inflation. You can make $10.25 an hour, work at Starbucks, be single, and pay in the top tax bracket, because years ago that was big money. Corporate income tax in Virginia. We have about 80,000 corporate income taxpayers. Fewer than 1% send in more than half the revenue to the state. Okay, we have about 60,000 corporate taxpayers that pay an average of $300 a year. Their compliance costs are thousands of dollars a year. That's not an efficient tax system. That's a nuisance. And so those are the kinds of things when we talk about reform and how Virginia compares to other states. Just 2 or 3 examples of the kinds of things that are on our front burner, and I hope certainly my plate, where you all might become involved and want to look at things. Last thing I'll mention, and I'll sit down because I know we want to go to questions. If there were an index out there that I'd like to see that I haven't found yet, gets to the comment that was made when I was introduced earlier, the transparency index. Because I'm a big believer in that. I've had a number of bills, won't go into all of them in detail, but the more, this is certainly coming from a limited government guy, the more people can see inside government and how it works, the more limited they will want it to be in a wide range of areas, whether it's just what government's spending things on. We have a really good system in Virginia. In fact, It's so good, we've had two. We have one of these government checkbooks. You can see everything the government purchases, and you can see everything the government pays for. I thought this was fantastic until I found out they don't talk to each other. Okay, there's no reconciling electronically of what the state buys and what the state's paying for. Virginia was a publicly traded corporation on the New York Stock Exchange. We'd all be felons because no publicly traded company could be operated so in such a shabby manner. So that's just voting records. We're going to put road maintenance records online. But the more people can see what's going on inside a government, a lot of these problems, there are a lot of things that could become problems or fester over time, kind of get corrected because people inside government know you're looking and they want to look good. So I'll stop there. Be happy to take your questions. Thank you.
We are certainly going to take questions from the folks here in the room, but those who are watching via webcast are welcome to submit questions too. If you look at your screen, you look down to the bottom left of the screen, there should be a little icon there that looks sort of like a talk bubble from a cartoon in the newspaper. If you'll click on that, it'll bring up a box. You can enter your question and then just follow the prompts and submit it. And our mistress of technology here in the room will then ask your question for you. For those of you who are on Twitter following us, please feel free to contact us at #FreeStates. It's one word, Free States with an S at the end. And so let's go ahead and begin the questions. Let's put them to the test, see what they can tell you. Yes, sir, in the back. And I believe there's a microphone coming to you. We'll give Brady a workout going across the room.
John Sacco from George Mason University, and like our legislature, I also have a business, and so I know about meeting payrolls. If the GDP in the United States the last 12 years has barely been above 3.0, which is usually the mark for new employment, is it possible that you're looking at the trees and not the forest?
To whom do you want to direct the question?
If the GDP has been rarely above, annual real GDP has been rarely above 3.0, the mark for new employment, and unemployment is still 7.6%, are you looking at the trees and not the forest? I mean, does it really matter if a couple states are economically progressive and other states are not?
Yeah, because I think there's quite a bit of variance across the states in terms of employment growth and income growth. So states like Texas and North Dakota have had big booms in employment and are attracting people. If the whole country were like that, then we wouldn't have 7.6% employment. Maybe we'd have 5% employment. So if the states enacted better policies, maybe we would have recovered from this recession much more quickly.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that the federal government is a big overhang on even what happens in the states. So that being said, we know that margins matter. Isn't that what we learn in economics? And what's happening in the states is changing things at the margins. And so I think you'll see, some states will perform better, some states will perform worse. Of course, the federal government is going to impact that. It'd be nice if we can get change in both Washington and the state capitals. But what we're trying to tell at least the states is, you can't control so much what happens at the federal government. Here's what you can control to try to help shape your destiny as a state and as a people of that state.
Yeah, I mean, to your point as well, I mean, if our federal government, our national economy grew like California's, we'd be Greece today. And if it grew like Texas, we'd be a whole lot better off. So in one of the comparisons that we have, the 9 states without income taxes, for instance, 5.5% job growth over the last decade. The states with the highest income tax rates, negative 1.5% job growth. So, I mean, there is that, strong correlation there.
Other comments? All right, we'll move on to the next question.
We have a question from our webcast. This is for Will Ruger. How is federal executive branch controls affecting the personal freedom in the states?
how is, can you repeat that again? Federal executive branch controls?
Correct.
Well, on a lot of areas that we're talking about in terms of personal freedom, states have the ability to shape those policies, in some ways unhindered from the federal government. I mean, take a small example, raw milk sales. I don't think the federal government intervenes too much in raw milk sales. Now, certainly there are other areas, education policy, where the federal government is starting in more and more over time to encroach, and healthcare policy is the big one, where Obamacare, ACA. We're not exactly sure. We have to read the bill, as Nancy Pelosi says, to understand how it's going to affect us. But we're still not sure, even today, what that means for the states in terms of their ability to compete on that level. But I think it varies across policy areas, which is true in general, just because states have typically had more room in some areas than others, to negotiate our kind of federal system.
Yeah. And the federal government, of course, can use grant money to incentivize states to restrict certain freedoms. We've seen that with a lot of the travel freedoms we code.
Right.
Federal highway funds are conditioned on passing certain laws restricting what motorists can do.
Yeah, I think if you look overall at the aggregate picture of state budgets, our friends at State Budget Solutions came out with a report in the last month or so to show the percentage of state budgets that are federal funds related to federal grants continues to grow. Mm-hmm. In fact, some states, I think Mississippi is the most reliant at nearly 50% of their state general fund budget coming from federal funds. That is a big problem in terms of states that want to get their own act together, because of course we all know that the money doesn't come without strings. And a lot of times the strings last a whole lot longer than the money does, as I think is going to be the case with the Medicaid expansion. As the reimbursement rates go down, the strings are still going to be there. And your point to transportation, I mean, there's no reason why we still have the Eisenhower interstate system created in the 1950s, was supposed to be done in the 1960s, still run through Washington, D.C.
Next question. The lady over here in the lovely velvet jacket.
Hi, this is for the author, Sorensen Ruger. A lot of the popular ideas these days are talk about happiness, and people will start measuring happiness in all sorts of areas. And I was wondering, is there any aspect of happiness that you measure in your study, any correlation with happiness and freedom in these days?
I mean, that's a good question. And people are, as you said, even the country of Bhutan doesn't want to focus on gross domestic product. It wants to focus on gross national happiness. But I will say that not only does it make me happy and others to be free, but there are also all kinds of good correlates of freedom, like economic growth, that tend to produce some of the great things in life. Now, whether it makes you happy or not, but shrinking infant mortality rates and having more than less food on the table, those things make me happy. Now, again, there's diminishing, marginal returns perhaps, but I can't really speak so much about the relationship between happiness per se and our study. It'd be interesting to see if some measures of happiness out there would correlate with that. But then the devil would be in the details. What do they mean by happiness? Does it mean to have absolute security of your job? Well, great, but then you'll be more like France, and that will have other negative correlates. So it's going to be in the devils of the details there. I mean, creative destruction can mean some friction in an economy, but it also can mean kind of great wealth creation. And so happiness isn't unimportant. And I think a lot of the things that correlate with freedom do make us happy. The ability, for example, to live our lives as we see fit without Mayor Bloomberg telling us how to live them. And I'm guessing that people wouldn't feel too happy, for example, if the mayor was going to tell them what kind of sodas they can drink, or what kind of how much pain medicine they can have in hospitals, or things like that. So again, we don't have any specific numbers there, but my guess is that just intuitively, it seems, being able to satisfy your preferences would make one happy, and one can satisfy their preferences when they're free to do so, absent government coercion.
Anything else?
Oh, nothing for me.
We have another online question. In the third edition of the index, has the study had any impact on state policies like in New Hampshire?
I think it has been used. We know that it's been introduced into testimony at state legislatures. I know people in New Hampshire, for instance, who've proposed laws, written the laws, got them enacted, that increased freedom in various ways. There's a recent law that legalized micro and nano breweries, and that passed. It was actually a couple of free stater legislators there in New Hampshire who wrote that and got it passed. A bill eliminating all restrictions on the ownership and carrying of knives. So, small things, but what about me? Well, I'm planning to move to New Hampshire myself, in part because of what we found with its relative level of freedom. So,
especially compared to where he lives now in New York.
That's right. That's right.
But I'll have an anecdote too. I was giving a talk in Arizona last week, and I met a couple from California, and they're thinking about relocating to either New Hampshire or Texas. And the kind of things that we're talking about in their index are part of their decision-making matrix. And so I think, I'm guessing there are a lot of anecdotes like that. It enters into their thinking. It's not everything, and we don't claim that it's everything. People move for a lot of different reasons. But certainly I think that an environment that is conducive to the way you would like to live is one that's going to be very attractive.
Gentleman right here in the very attractive Adam Smith tie.
Hi, William Freeland. My question is, I guess, about migration. Some of the discussion on that. There's been a ton of controversy and debates about how much actually public policy has to do, economic freedom, tax rates, has to do with migration, what effect it has. A lot of people sort of left of center are suggesting, you mentioned weather. They also talk about cost of living, housing prices, and a lot of other variables. For both of you, for I guess everyone on the panel, what are your thoughts on the sort of the state of like research and consensus on that? And do you think that the research that you're doing is going to make a contribution that will sort of move the ball on the consensus? Because there's just a tremendous amount of disagreement about what's causing migration, whether policy has anything to do with it.
Yeah. So on cost of living, we do control for that, and we find that even when we control for cost of living, that all three dimensions of freedom are statistically significantly positively associated with migration. Now, cost of living is also strongly associated with migration. People move from high cost of living states to low cost of living states. But even that is in part perhaps an effect of policies in our freedom index. So we find a very strong correlation between cost of living measures for the states and our measure of land use regulation. So states that have very strict laws on real estate development have higher cost of living, higher housing prices, and that's not surprising. We also find a less strong but still fairly strong correlation between taxes and cost of living, implying perhaps that high tax states also have high cost of living, perhaps because businesses have to take care of these expenses and pass them on to consumers. Oh, there we go.
I think we have a question down front here too.
Close? Speak close to the mic, like this.
We got you.
My name is Luca Gattonicelli. I'm with the American Spectator, and big hit piece in the works. So no, just kidding. Although I do have a question about some of these numbers here, because I actually did study economics, and I noticed that your R-squared values, especially for the the income growth, was like 29.8%. And I know that, obviously the standard error, it's like very robust, but the correlation coefficient is still, what do you think about that? Because you guys are touting these results, but if you really look at the numbers, people might say, well, who's to say that there are other variables that are more important?
Right. So those R-squareds, what that means just intuitively is that our model right there explains about 30% of the variance in real income growth across the states. So that's saying that there's about 70% that's unexplained. So there's lots of other factors that also affect income growth. Things like, what is the maybe employment participation rate, labor force participation rate, who's participating in the labor force. Things like world prices for soybeans and oil and things like that that affect how states' economies that produce those things respond. So there are lots of other random factors that affect income growth, and we're certainly not denying that. But most of those random factors are out of the control of policymakers. So they can make a difference on the margins by improving the environment for economic freedom. And yes, the effects might be modest, but there's still, the substantive effects that we find are still pretty important here. So with regulatory policy, what that implies is a half-point increase on regulatory policy, which is, I think, about half the range of the variable in our index, is associated with every year about 0.7 percentage points higher economic growth. That's pretty significant when we're talking about GDP growth of 3%, right? If you could have that 3.7% every single year, that's not nothing.
Great question, though, by the way.
Yeah.
We have a question from Twitter for Jim Lemunyon. Do studies like this help you as you try to persuade fellow politicians, and what pushback do you receive?
Well, the answer is yes. People do pay attention, especially if your state's not ranked number one, because there's always, you say, well, what could we be doing more? The pushback comes in what I call the prescription. So, okay, we're number 10, and I'm on a particular index. What do you need to do to be higher? And is that going to matter to the people who elect you? Because in the end of the day, that's kind of what elected people are. It's all got to translate down into voters. And one of the things I didn't talk about, which I don't think we have, is when we look at the remedies for making improvement in whatever scale or category you're in, how do you determine the big lever issues, I'll call, versus a lot of little lever issues? What's really going to make a big positive impact that people who vote are going to notice? And that's what makes the prescriptive side of this, I think, fairly complicated in some cases, and certainly makes life interesting.
Yeah, and we would want to stress, again, legislators in the particular states are going to have a lot more local knowledge to take what we're saying here and put it into practice. And that's, again, one of the reasons why we wanted to have someone in the world of politics on the panel, because we want to translate ideas into practice, and they're better suited on one end, and we think we're well suited at the other. It's the connection between these two things that's most important, and that's why we want to go to the states. It's why we've been to these. We gave a talk at the State House a couple years ago in New Hampshire, in Ohio. They've used our study and testimony there, and so on and so forth, because we want to translate this there, and we don't claim expertise on how to best put it into place. And that's why we're really excited about having the delegate here. And in fact, I think we have a question, if you don't mind, for the delegate related to this.
Well, we have a couple of general policy recommendations for Virginia, and we were wondering what you thought about them. And we did try to state these very generally because we don't have the local knowledge. But so one is reduce the number of state and local government employees to levels consistent with Virginia's low levels of spending and taxation, because Virginia is pretty high on government employment. And another one is reform the victimless crimes regime to make it consistent with national norms. Doing this would have raised Virginia's personal freedom ranking from 38th to 22nd, and its overall freedom ranking from 8th to 6th. So Virginia is pretty high on incarceration rates and things like that. So those are pretty general, and there are many ways, obviously, to accomplish those objectives, but we were wondering what you thought about them.
Well, the point that you make is good, and that is how do you compare, what's the benchmarking for Virginia or any state versus others? So I would say, I think at the state level, this does not include local government employees, including school teachers. We have about 100 or 105,000 state employees. Our general fund budget's about 20 billion. So I'd be interested in just seeing how that compares to other state budgets who are roughly 20 billion or a little bit more, a little bit less. Do they do that with 100,000 employees or more or less? What complicates it is each state is a little different in terms of what gets done at the state level versus what gets done at the local level, and so you need to compensate for that. It gets very complicated on the tax side, especially in a place like Virginia. In terms of the victimless crime, I'm not a crime expert. We have a crime commission in Virginia that looks at a whole bunch of things related to the crime statute, recommends changes to the legislature, but if you got a list of here are things that are not crimes in 40 other states but are in Virginia, I'd get that to the Crime Commission. I'd be happy to send it to them. I know the guys on there, and have them take a look at it, because that will at least get a discussion going. There was a presentation at ALEC last year about comparing states' requirements for business licenses. If you're a hairdresser, do you need a license? If you're a florist, do you need a license? There was actually one state that required a license to be a florist. There's other, if you need a school teacher, if you're a school teacher, I think all 50 states, you said you had to have a teaching license, you had to be certified, or an attorney, or an accountant. But how that varies in 100 different occupations is actually fairly significant from state to state, but it's the kind of thing that doesn't say, and therefore Virginia's got to change, or this state's got to change, but at least it gets a discussion going.
Yeah, and on that point, especially on occupational licensing, we can hopefully, or legislators and their staffers can use the index to talk through those things and say things like, are the citizens at risk in these 47 other states where those people are actually allowed to do this without a license? I mean, the people must be dying in the streets, right? I mean, that's a good rhetorical move, I think. And I think occupational licensing is one of those low-hanging fruit where you see a kind of left-right coalition, if you will, where, bloggers like Matt Iglesias have talked about some of the problems of occupational licensing. Lots of people, in the ALEC network and others have too. And hopefully there's opportunities, not just for people, that are, Republicans or conservatives or classical liberals, but also people, across the political spectrum to find ways to increase freedom in the areas that at least they think are important. Because again, it's not just there's not just one way to look at or one set of policies. It's not just about economic policy, and that's actually, I think, one of our advantages in terms of our study compared to other studies of freedom is that we aren't just looking at, well, what are the taxes, right? Freedom is more than simply the tax burden. Now, of course, that's an important part of it. Economic freedom is inseparable from freedom in general, as Milton Friedman talked about. But we also focus on personal freedom here. And I think that's what's made our study so attractive to a lot of Americans in the last couple editions. And I think for this one, too, is that we're trying to look at the totality of freedom, not just what, say, businesses care about, which is not to say that those things aren't important. They certainly are. But we're offering a kind of more holistic approach.
Question from back there.
We have one from Twitter. Someone pointed out that states with high populations are more on the lower end of the ranking, while states with smaller populations are on the higher. Now, they asked, does this mean that people prefer less freedom?
No, not really. No.
I mean, look at Texas, right? I mean, Texas is 14th in the rankings, and it's it's a humongous state, both geographically and population-wise. Or, Tennessee's not a tiny state, and it comes in third in our rankings. So yeah, South Dakota and North Dakota are relatively, not very populous, but again, there's lots of bigger states. Think about Arizona, and so forth. Now, it is true that New York and California are performing poorly, and that's going to probably skew maybe our perception of this. And on that point, there's not a correlation, for example, between urbanization and freedom. So it's also not just that it's rural states, and I think that's an important aspect too to kind of talk to.
Yeah, I do think there is a sense in which states that have that lack some of the natural amenities that otherwise attract people have to have greater freedom to try to attract people, and that may be one reason why the Dakotas tend to do well, and some of these other states that that are not getting loads of retirees and loads of highly educated IT professionals or whatever. These are states that they need to have economic freedom in order to attract investment. So we are going to see some of that that relationship, controlling for natural amenities. Freedom matters for attracting investment.
Yeah, I mean, just think about Virginia here. Virginia is 8th. It's not a tiny state. It's not, just a rural state. It's a mix of urban and rural. So I'm not sure that that's really at play, even though, looking at our top 5 states, one might think that.
Yeah, of course, New York and California are large, but they've been large for a long time. They're declining now, of course. Actually, over the last 50 years, it was, believe it or not, New York has lost 14 congressional seats on net, just because of the huge population outflow. Now, of course, weather's not good there, but of course, you can't make that same case with California losing people.
Question from the gentleman in the striped sweater.
Yeah, my question is for Delegate Lemunyan. So Virginia shows up pretty well overall, but 42nd in alcohol, and that's one place for reform, especially with the liquor monopoly. Governor McDonald, had a proposal, and I guess that didn't pan out in the legislature. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. My understanding is that the proposal was connected to transportation policy and transportation politics as far as where the tax revenue would go, and that kind of muddied the conversation, in my opinion, and maybe kind of tricked it up a little bit. But it seems that on the face of it, there's no reason, obviously, for Virginia to be in the liquor business. So if you could, is there any prospect of that coming back, and how can Virginia kind of get over this hurdle?
No prospect that it's coming back, and the beer and wine lobby killed it. What the governor was trying to do is monetize the inherent value of these liquor stores that are now state-owned and devote that money to transportation. The beer and wine guys were serious. They didn't. The way it was going to roll out is you could go to Safeway or Giant, you'd have the beer and wine aisle, and then you could have hard liquor at the end of the aisle. And they were afraid that they'd lose business if they had to compete head-to-head, bottle-to-bottle, can-to-can with hard liquor on the shelf, and they don't like that. It's the way the real world works. Other states do it differently. The other thing that happened is it wasn't just the privatizing the existing 330 ABC stores in Virginia. It was, let's create another 300 or so liquor licenses, and who would want those? Well, maybe it would be Costco. Maybe it would be Walmart. Well, if they're going to get into the liquor business, why would anybody want to buy one of these existing ABC stores? Because if you got a Walmart down the road, you're going to get blown away. So the process of taking liquor licenses, putting them to auction, and how many of different size store would get what, frankly, just became too complicated to get that done in a realistic way. And it hasn't happened to the point of how does it compare to other states. The process of privatizing has not happened that frequently since Prohibition. I mean, there was the sort of decisions made in the late 20s and 1930s. Virginia's laws go back to the 1930s, but since then, you could maybe point to 3 or 4 states in 7 or 8 decades that have actually gone through this. So there wasn't a lot of case history for us to point to saying, here's the way we want to do it, here's what we want to avoid.
And let's face it, I mean, the monopoly of alcohol distribution and sales is a big moneymaker for states in a lot of cases. Washington State was the last state to privatize just about a year ago, and the way that the legislature wanted to do it, it was an initiative, actually, it's a statewide ballot initiative, but they wanted to do it in a way that held the state, quote-unquote, harmless from a revenue perspective. So even though they privatized the system, now they have some of the highest liquor taxes in the country, and there was a Wall Street Journal story not long ago talking about how consumers are going down to Oregon to purchase alcohol because it's that much cheaper, even after they've privatized, because the rates are still too high. So you get in that situation too, where state government doesn't want to give up the revenue in a lot of cases. Now this battle is being fought as we speak in Pennsylvania, where the state house just voted a couple of weeks ago to end what former Governor Dick Thornburg called the Soviet-style system of alcohol distribution in Pennsylvania. We'll see if that goes anywhere. We should know, later on this year.
Yeah, maybe just to hop back on that, and it also gets to what bugs people who vote, okay, day to day. This isn't a problem. I mean, I go door to door, talk to people, how am I doing, who are you going to vote for this year? This rarely ever comes up, okay? But just to give you some context, in the 6 weeks we were in session, I got more than 900 email messages on Medicaid reform. Okay, I got 128 messages from some animal rights group that's worried about foxes in these 1 or 2 acre fenced-in areas that are used to train hound dogs. Okay, and of course the fox can't get out, so the dogs catch the fox and rip it to shreds, and they don't like that happening to foxes, and I can understand that. I got 2 people wrote me in on marijuana liberalization, all right, and I got others kind of in between that. So elected officials are going to sort of, not always, but move with kind of what's on people's minds, and as long as they can get to the ABC store, all right, they're cool.
Is a question from the web?
For Will and Jason and for Jonathan as well, how do you guys decide how to weight the different rankings? Jonathan, I think you mentioned that unweighted within yours, the freedom of the 50 states is weighted. How do you guys decide, and how do you account for some of the different results, or the same results that come from doing that?
Okay, were you able to hear the question? I was able to hear part of it.
Can you repeat it on the mics for the online audience, please?
So the question was, how do you weight the variables to come up with the ranking? So in our case, with this edition, we are weighting the policies by the dollar value of freedom to the people who enjoy it. So we literally have if you download the spreadsheet, there's a dollar figure next to every variable. And we basically add up all those dollar values to get a sum over all variables in the database. And the weight for a variable is its percentage of that sum. Right, so I mentioned happy hour laws, which I think are 0.02% of the index, and that's, the weight is something like, it's worth, let's say, $5 million nationwide. We do this nationwide, so the dollar value represents the nationwide value of a standardized change in the variable, and so some variables are worth a lot and some not so much.
I think we maybe have time for one more question.
You have one question? Sorry. What trends are you seeing that give you optimism, and which ones give you concern?
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, I mean, one of the things that's exciting to me is to see the states challenge the federal government. So when Washington and Colorado try to take on the federal government, or even California to a certain extent, right? That makes me excited, because I think states should, in our federal system, right? All the different bodies are supposed to try to defend their powers, and I would like to see the states, and also the Senate and the House, defend themselves in particular, for the part of the government that they're supposed to perform. And I don't think we should just leave it to the federal government to protect our freedoms. I think states can do this even if they have to challenge the federal government. Now, of course, they're going to have, limited means in some cases, but we have this system for a reason. I mean, I don't have to send you back to the Federalist Papers, but there's a good logic in there for how states can do that. And I'm not talking about necessarily nullification or anything like that, but just within even the kind of accepted practices, they can do so. And we've seen states do that. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think Maine tried to challenge the federal government when it came to the parts of the Patriot Act, and the federal government backed down a little bit. And then in the case of Colorado and Washington, I think states can do this on a number of different areas. And I would like to see the states hold together a little bit better when it comes to the ACA as well. Although, like in Florida, you've seen a little backsliding by people who were going to stand up to the feds there a bit.
Yeah, I think we've seen, if we're talking about personal freedoms, we've seen some of the most dramatic changes in the last few years. So, we've seen from our perspective, encouraging change on marijuana laws, on the availability of same-sex partnerships. But we've seen troubling trends in other areas, most especially on tobacco laws. Smoking bans have gone across most of the country. And it's understandable why. It's a straightforward tyranny of the majority issue. I'm a non-smoker myself, so personally, smoking bans are good for me. I don't like cigarette smoke, but it's a matter of the property rights of each owner of each restaurant or bar to decide what the policies should be for that site. That's our view. But it's hard to make that case, that principled philosophical case for property rights, when people are mostly concerned with their own well-being. So we've seen dramatic changes there that have been more negative.
Yeah, and over the last decade, we've seen some response to the Kelo decision, where some states have tried to reform eminent domain. Some have gone further than others, and we would encourage states to try to protect property rights more thoroughly. But we have seen some positive, movement on that decision. Not enough, but more, and I look forward to seeing more from some of the states that haven't.
A couple of the positive trends, I think, are states are increasingly aware of the competitiveness of capital, especially human and investment capital across the states. And, we kind of talk about in jest how governors are ribbing themselves over winning different companies or winning, in the race for capital. But it's a real issue that we've seen many governors and state legislatures across the country take up to say we need to reduce taxes, we need to make our business climate more friendly because of state X, Y, or Z in our bordering area especially, that's now all of a sudden winning the cross-border war for capital. Another encouraging trend, I think, has been states willing to take on the tough questions that for many years they were not willing to take on, such as Democrats in Rhode Island, Republicans in Utah taking on the issue of pension reform and really reforming entitlements, where if we don't tackle that issue, that is a fiscal cliff waiting to happen for every state across the country. But on the discouraging note, I think we have to be very vigilant as people who believe in liberty and this system of laboratories of democracy to make sure that we can keep it that way. Over time, there has been, of course, a federal encroachment on the autonomy of states. And at some point, if you want to get out of that trap, you got to let go of the cheese, as they say, the free, quote-unquote, free federal dollars coming out to the states. And I think that's going to be a trend that's going to be a fight for the long term.
Yeah, and before we end, I want to again thank Delegate Lemunyan for coming out. I love to have kind of idea people and practitioners together talking about these things. I also want to thank Jonathan for coming. The Rich State, Poor States is a great study. I've learned a lot from it. I think it's in its 5th edition now. Yeah. And they do great work over there at ALEC. So thank you very much for coming out here and supporting us, and we'd be happy to support your efforts as well.
Anything else from the panel? Hearing nothing, the clock has struck 1:30, and I promise that we would be respectful of your time. To our friends who are watching on the web, and particularly to our friends in the State Policy Network, state-based think tanks, we appreciate you tuning in as you have. To those of you here in the room, thank you so much for your time and your thoughtful questions. Please join me in now thanking our panel.